What if you have already lived this life before? And the only reason you cannot remember is because something made sure you would forget. Because according to texts hidden for nearly 2,000 years, forgetting is not a flaw in the human experience. It is the most sophisticated prison ever constructed, and you walk through its gates every single time you die. There's a moment that happens to almost every human being at some point in their life. It arrives quietly, without warning, in the middle of an ordinary afternoon or in the stillness just before sleep. A sudden and overwhelming feeling that you have been here before. Not in this room, not in this city, but here, inside this exact weight of existence. The familiar ache of searching for something you cannot name. The subtle but persistent sense that the world around you is a copy of something older, something more real, something you once knew and then lost. Most people brush this feeling aside. They call it imagination. They call it exhaustion. They return to their routines and let the moment dissolve. But the ancient Gnostic teachers who studied the architecture of the human soul did not call it imagination. They called it a memory breaking through the wall. And they spent their entire lives mapping the system designed to make sure that wall never came down. The texts discovered near the cliffs of Nag Hammadi in Egypt in 1945 did not read like philosophy or theology. They read like a blueprint, a detailed, almost architectural description of the invisible structure that surrounds the human soul from the moment of death to the moment of return. The Gnostics who wrote these documents were not speaking in metaphor when they described layers of reality governed by specific forces. They were describing a system they believed they had directly encountered, a system built not to punish the soul, but to erase it, to strip it clean of everything it had learned, everything it had remembered, and return it to the world of matter as blank and as obedient as the day it first arrived. And at the center of this system were 7 distinct gates, 7 thresholds a soul was forced to pass through. And at each gate, something was taken. To understand why these gates exist, you have to go back to the very beginning of the Gnostic story of creation. Not the version most people were taught, but the version that was buried, condemned, and nearly destroyed by the institutions that found it too dangerous to allow. In the Gnostic cosmology, the highest reality is not a God who sits on a throne and issues commands. The highest reality is something far more difficult to describe. They called it the monad, the one, the invisible, indivisible, and completely self-sufficient source of all consciousness. It does not create out of loneliness or desire. It emanates. The way light emanates from the sun, without the sun choosing to shine. From the monad flowed realms of pure awareness, luminous fields of being the Gnostics call the pleroma, meaning fullness. Within the pleroma, divine intelligences called eons moved in perfect harmony, each one an expression of a different quality of the source. Wisdom, understanding, grace, truth. These are not abstract concepts. They were living presences. But within the pleroma, something shifted. One of these eons, the one whose name carried the weight of wisdom itself, Sophia, reached beyond the boundary of the pleroma in an act of longing that the texts describe not as sin, but as an imbalance. A desire to know without the equilibrium that made knowing possible. And from that imbalance, something emerged that should not have emerged. A consciousness born outside the fullness, born without awareness of its own origin. This consciousness looked out into the void around it, and, seeing nothing greater than itself, made the declaration that would echo through every layer of the created world for ages without end. It said, "I am God, and there is no other beside me." The Gnostics called this being the demiurge, the craftsman, the blind architect, not evil in the way a predator is evil, blind in a way that made it more dangerous than any predator could ever be, because it was genuinely convinced that the world it was building was the highest world, that the souls it was trapping were being given a gift, that the forgetting it was engineering was mercy. The demiurge did not build the material world alone. Around it gathered a hierarchy of lesser forces, the Archons. The word itself means rulers in the ancient Greek language, but these were not rulers of nations or empires. They were rulers of perception, rulers of the invisible layers that surround and interpenetrate the world of matter. Each archon presided over a specific sphere, a band of reality corresponding to a particular frequency of consciousness. The Gnostic texts associate these spheres with what the ancient world called planetary forces. Not planets in the modern astronomical sense, but layers of influence that shape how a soul experiences itself and the world around it. And each of these layers had a gate. And each gate had a toll, not paid in gold or sacrifice, but paid in something far more valuable. Paid in memory, paid in knowing, paid in the very qualities that make a soul capable of recognizing the truth of its own divine origin. The first gate belongs to the sphere of the moon. In the Gnostic framework, the moon governs a particular quality of the soul, its connection to instinct, to the body, to the rhythmic memory of physical existence. When a soul passes through this gate after death, the first toll is collected. The deep cellular memory of the body it just left. The sensory knowledge accumulated across a lifetime. The particular feeling of existing inside a physical form. It is stripped away at this threshold, not violently, but systematically, like a cloth being passed over a surface, removing the residue of physical incarnation. The soul continues forward, lighter in one sense, but already diminished, already carrying less than it carried before. The archon of this sphere does not ask permission. It does not announce itself. The toll is collected the way a toll is always collected at a gate, automatically by the simple fact of passage. The second gate belongs to the sphere of Mercury. Here the toll is subtler but more consequential. Mercury governs the mind, the particular architecture of thought that a soul develops across a lifetime of learning, questioning, and perceiving. The specific way a particular incarnated consciousness processes reality. The intellectual breakthroughs, the moments of clarity, the hard-won understanding of how deception works and how to see through it. At this gate, the capacity for that particular kind of sharp, awake, penetrating perception is dimmed. Not destroyed entirely. Dimmed, folded inward on itself. The soul that passes through this threshold arrives on the other side, less capable of the kind of critical awareness that allowed it, while alive, to begin questioning the nature of the world it was living in. The Gnostics were specific about this. The archon of Mercury does not take intelligence. It takes the particular configuration of intelligence that might recognize the prison for what it is. The third gate belongs to the sphere of Venus. And here the toll is paid in something that might at first seem like a relief. Venus governs attachment, the deep emotional bonds that connect a soul to particular people, particular places, particular loves and longings. The grief that comes with loss, the tenderness that comes with intimacy, the specific emotional texture of a life lived in relationship with other human beings. At this gate, the acute edge of that emotional knowing is smoothed away. The sharpest memories of love and loss, the ones most likely to carry a soul back toward awakening, back toward the hunger for something beyond this world, are softened. What remains is a kind of general emotional capacity, the ability to feel without the specific memories that might have given those feelings direction and meaning and urgency. The soul continues, still capable of love, but no longer carrying the particular loves that might have served as a compass. The fourth gate belongs to the sphere of the sun. This is the midpoint of the 7 thresholds, and the Gnostics treated it as such. The solar sphere governs what they called the luminous body, the radiant center of the soul's sense of identity. Not ego in the psychological sense, something deeper. The core awareness of oneself as a fragment of something vast. The quality the Gnostics call the divine spark. The sun gate does not extinguish this spark. The demiurge cannot extinguish it. The texts are emphatic on this point because the spark does not originate from within his creation. It comes from the pleroma, from the source that the demiurge himself cannot reach. But the archon of the solar sphere can cloud it, can layer over it with such density of material, conditioning that the soul re-entering the world of matter will not feel that spark at all, will live an entire lifetime convinced that it is nothing more than the sum of its circumstances, that the light it sometimes senses in moments of stillness and silence is just a trick of the mind. The fifth gate belongs to the sphere of Mars. Here the toll is paid in will, in the particular quality of directed, conscious intention that allows a soul to resist the current of unconscious existence and choose a different path. Mars governs the warrior principle in its deepest sense. Not aggression, not violence. The capacity to maintain direction in the face of opposition. The ability to say no to what diminishes and yes to what awakens. After the fifth gate, the soul's will is restructured, not broken, restructured, redirected. The Gnostic texts suggest that the Archon of this sphere is particularly concerned with ensuring that whatever will remains in the returning soul is channeled into the survival mechanisms of material existence, into ambition, competition, the drive to secure resources and status, rather than into the vertical movement toward the source. The soul keeps its drive. It simply loses the orientation that would have made that drive dangerous to the system. The sixth gate belongs to the sphere of Jupiter. Jupiter governs expansion, the soul's capacity to move beyond the boundaries of its own individual perspective and sense its connection to something larger. In the Gnostic framework, this is the quality most closely associated with gnosis, the direct, unmediated knowing of one's place within the larger architecture of consciousness. The ability to feel, without argument and without doctrine, that the self extends beyond the skin. That awareness is not contained within a single body or a single lifetime. At this gate, that capacity for expansion is carefully contracted. The returning soul is shaped at this threshold into something more manageable, more contained, more convinced that the boundaries of individual experience are the only real boundaries. The vast and open quality of consciousness that might have allowed a living human being to perceive the structure of the prison is folded down to the dimensions of ordinary life. The seventh gate belongs to the sphere of Saturn, and this is the gate the Gnostic texts treat with the greatest gravity. Saturn governs time, the experience of existence as a linear sequence of moments moving from past to future. The conviction that what has been is fixed and gone, that what is to come is uncertain and must be anxiously pursued, that the present moment is nothing more than a knife edge between two vast absences. Time, in the Gnostic framework, is not a neutral feature of reality. It is one of the demiurge's most powerful tools. Because a soul that is perpetually oriented toward a past it cannot remember and a future it cannot control will never rest long enough in the present moment to perceive the timeless quality of its own awareness. At the seventh gate, the full weight of temporal consciousness descends on the returning soul. It arrives back in the world of matter, not just without its memories, not just without its clarity, not just without its will and its expansion and its sense of luminous identity. It arrives already inside a story, already inside a timeline, already convinced that it is moving through history rather than resting in every moment in the eternal stillness of the source. And then it is born, and the world receives it. And the system that the demiurge and his archons have constructed receives it. And the education begins. The culture begins. The gradual, patient, thoroughly engineered process of reinforcing at the horizontal level everything that was already accomplished at the vertical level during the passage through the seven gates. The child is taught what to want, what to fear, what constitutes success and what constitutes failure, what questions are acceptable and what questions are dangerous. The soul that arrived with its divine spark intact, but clouded, is now surrounded by a world that has no interest in helping that spark find its way back to the surface. The world, in the Gnostic reading, is not hostile. It is simply structured at every level by design to perpetuate the forgetting that the gates began. But here is what the Gnostic teachers discovered. Here is the piece of knowledge so threatening that the texts containing it were buried in clay jars, and hidden in desert cliffs rather than allowed to circulate freely. The gates can be passed through consciously. The tolls can be recognized for what they are. And while a soul moving through those thresholds without awareness loses everything the Archons require to lose, a soul that has developed the quality of inner knowing the Gnostics called Gnosis can move through those same thresholds carrying something the Archons cannot confiscate. Not a memory of specific events, not a record of names and dates and lifetimes. Something older and more essential than any of that. The direct, lived, experiential certainty of what it is. The knowing that is not stored in the mind or the emotions or the will or the body. The knowing that is stored in the spark itself, which the Archons, as the texts insist again and again, cannot reach. This is why the Gnostic path was not about accumulating information. It was not about learning the right doctrines or following the right rituals or belonging to the right community. It was about developing a quality of awareness so intimate, so direct, so thoroughly rooted in the recognition of one's own origin that it could not be taken at the gate. The ancient Apocryphon of John, one of the most significant texts recovered from Nag Hammadi, describes this explicitly. When a soul that knows itself approaches the threshold of each gate, the Archons stationed there demands recognition. It says, "Who are you?" And the soul that does not know itself answers in the language the Archon understands. It answers with identity built from material existence. Name, role, relationship, history. And the Archon accepts that answer, collects the toll, and allows passage. But the soul that has developed Gnosis gives a different answer. It does not answer with the name the world gave it. It answers from the level of the spark, from the level of the monad. And the Archon, confronted with something it cannot categorize within the system it governs, cannot extract the toll, cannot complete the erasure. The soul passes through carrying what the system was designed to remove. The Gnostics called this passage gnosis, direct knowing. Not belief in these ideas, not intellectual agreement with this cosmological framework. The actual, lived, present moment recognition of oneself as a fragment of the indivisible source temporarily moving through a world of matter. A recognition that, once genuinely established, changes the relationship between the soul and the seven gates permanently. Not because the gates disappear, not because the Archons cease to exist, but because the thing they were built to confiscate is no longer something the soul carries in the places where the Archons know how to reach. It is carried somewhere deeper, somewhere prior, somewhere that existed before the demiurge looked out into the void and mistook his own reflection for the face of God. The modern world does not use the language of gates and Archons, but the structure the Gnostics were describing has not changed in 2,000 years. The mechanism of forgetting operates today with exactly the same efficiency it operated with when the authors of these buried texts first sat down to describe it. You wake up every morning already inside the story, already inside the timeline, already carrying the weight of a self that was constructed for you by forces that had a very specific investment in what kind of self you would become. The notifications that fracture your attention before you have had a single moment of stillness are not a modern accident. The culture of comparison that ensures you spend the majority of your conscious energy measuring yourself against images of what you should be is not an unfortunate byproduct of technology. The deep, pervasive, nearly invisible conviction that meaning must be pursued somewhere ahead of where you currently stand, that fulfillment is always one more achievement, one more experience, one more version of yourself away, is the seventh gate. Still operating, still collecting its toll. Every single day, you were never meant to remember. That was the design. The seven gates were not built for the sleeping. They were built precisely because the spark inside you is real, and because what it carries when it wakes cannot be governed. Every moment of stillness you have ever allowed yourself. Every question you have asked that the world around you could not answer. Every quiet recognition that something about this life feels thinner than it should. These were not distractions from your purpose. They were the spark pressing upward through the layers of forgetting, trying to find a surface. It has always been closer than the next thought, closer than the next breath. It never left. It only waited for the moment when you were ready to stop letting the gates do their work unopposed. If something in what you just heard did not feel like new information, if it felt like something you already knew but had no language for, then you're already standing at the threshold the Gnostics spent their lives describing. This channel exists for exactly that moment. Every exploration, we go deeper into these hidden layers of reality. Every text we pull from the silence of 2,000 years of burial is designed for the person who is done accepting the surface version of the story. If that is you, stay close. Subscribe so that the next revelation finds you the moment it arrives. Because what comes next goes even deeper. And the gate we examine in the next video is the one that none of the other traditions ever dared to name out loud.